Thank you, Mr. Lorber. Mr. Hall, can you explain a bit about how the Kremlin uses business and finance as a counterintelligence tool?
Sure. I think the best way to look at it, again, is to imagine the Russian intelligence services and the Putin regime, the Kremlin itself, as collectors of information first and foremost. And unlike in our own intelligence community, where we oftentimes, if not almost exclusively, collect information for policymaking purposes, in Russia, what's collected is information that can then be used economically, if necessary, against targets of Putin's choosing and against the targets that the Russian intelligence services might choose. So that's a very powerful tool because, of course, when you're looking at how to leverage people, how to get people to do what it is that you want them to do, finances, their own personal economic, and of course they're also just their professional persona, oftentimes come into play in terms of what motivates people and how you can best leverage that. The Russian intelligence services are very active in doing precisely that.
And how might they use financial entanglement beyond for the purpose of gathering counterintelligence, but for the purpose of either gathering compromise or seeking to influence foreign decision-making?
I would say both is the answer to that. The first is the easy part for them. Collecting compromising information, kompromat, as we all know now the word in Russian, is what not only the FSB, the internal service, the SVR, the external service, the GRU, the entire security structure in Russia has been doing that for decades, if not arguably centuries. So this is something that they're set up to do. Whenever anybody comes to Russia, goes to Russia, that type of collection will be initiated against targets of interest. And what is gathered from those operations, from those collection operations, is either stored for later use or it can be simply used immediately. And the same holds true for financial information. I'm not sure if I got the second part of what your question was.
Well, let me ask you this. Do the Russians engage through their oligarchs, does the Kremlin engage through their oligarchs in illicit financial transactions with an eye to the fact that it may be useful in the future to hold those illicit transactions as compromise over the targets of those transactions?
Sure, that would certainly be consistent with some of the things that the Russian intelligence services have done in the past. Again, the goal is to collect compromising information that can indeed be used for any number of different activities against a given target down the road. So whether it is financial information, business information, or some things, just different things motivate different human beings, they will collect on all of those things in an effort to leverage those things to get people to do what they want them to do.
And can that financial entanglement take the form of money laundering?
Yes, absolutely. The Russians have a long history of money laundering, not just for the purposes of avoiding sanctions and that sort of thing, but in basic intelligence operations when they want their operations to be funded in a certain way that is not easily discoverable. There may be some folks in Caribbean islands someplace who money launder better than the Russians do, but the Russians are right up there.
Ambassador McFaul, in your written testimony, you talk about or make reference to the effort to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. Viewing this from the Russian perspective, let me ask you a couple things. If a presidential candidate sought to make a major real estate deal in Moscow during the campaign, is that something that would have come to the attention of Vladimir Putin?
I don't know. I want to be clear. I think we should know the facts of that. Let me speak generally that over the course of time in Russia, to do big business deals requires permission from the Kremlin. Anders Ostlund, one of my colleagues at the Atlantic Council, has just written a fantastic book, if I can recommend it to you all, coming out in May. And he estimates that any deal over $1 billion has to get direct approval from the Kremlin. And remember, just to build on some things that Steve said, Putin is using that not just as a way to enrich his friends and redistribute property to enrich his friends, but he's also doing that to make those people loyal. And here I mean domestic and foreign. If you want to do a major multi-billion-dollar transaction in Russia, You need to coordinate and be loyal to President Putin. That's a very different, I just want to echo another thing Steve said. You don't have to do that in the United States of America, right? Thankfully, we don't have that. But in that system, with the state being at the center of everything, you have to have, at a minimum, that kind of coordination with the Kremlin.
You know, there are public reports that the Trump organization sought to enlist the help of Dmitry Peskov.
Yes.
Can you tell us who Dmitry Peskov is? How close is he to Putin? And how would Mr. Peskov view that kind of overture or request for assistance coming from the business of a presidential candidate?
So I know Dmitry Peskov. I haven't seen him for 5 years because I'm on the Russian sanctions list, so I haven't been there recently. But when I was ambassador, I used to deal with him closely. He's not just the press secretary for the president, as is commonly reported. He's a very close advisor to President Putin. Has aspirations for other bigger jobs, by the way. To be honest, I think it's rather naive for somebody to try to call Peskov to do a business deal. But I think that reflects a common perception that you have to deal with the Kremlin. I think there are more sophisticated ways that you would do that. But most certainly, he has the public image of being very close to Putin. And if you were looking for a way to get to Putin, most certainly you try to reach out to Mr. Peskov.
And what about the necessity of obtaining financing from one of the major Russian banks? Can you tell us about the relationship between those banks and the Kremlin and how the Kremlin uses those as an instrument of state policy?
Well, all the three major banks, and even the fourth and fifth bank, but the three big ones, the Bear Bank, VEB, and VTB, are all owned by the government. Remember that always. I think there's variation in the way that those banks operate in the world. I think Sberbank operates a little bit more like a normal bank. They have deposits and they seek business opportunities. VEB is different. I think that's the one you're referring to. VEB is not really a bank. It's completely controlled by the Kremlin. It's referred to in the press in Russia as Putin's bank. The former head of it, I think you mentioned him in your opening remarks, Sergei Gorkov, was also an intelligence officer. The new head of it is Igor Shuvalov, somebody I used to work very closely with. He used to be the deputy prime minister, really in charge of the government in terms of economic policy. And it's completely controlled and acts on the behalf of the Kremlin.
Ms. Conley, one of the running themes through the last couple of years has been an effort by the Russians to do away with sanctions on Russia over its interference in our election, over its invasion of Crimea. Can you talk about the centrality of efforts to do away with sanctions, which we have seen so recurrently in our investigation? Why is that such a top priority for the Kremlin?
Mr. Chairman, it's important because Vladimir Putin has to manage a very challenging long-term decline of the Russian economy. He needs those sanctions to be lifted, particularly in the financial space, to allow needed funds to come into the Russian economy. So this is, in some ways, it's always about regime survival, but the economic means are very important. Because the sanctions have been tailored to many members of his inner circle, that also increases pressure on that as well. We had anticipated that the European Union individual members might challenge the longstanding EU sanctions. They have not, which is very positive. But in our research, what we found is, but we can't be comforted even by our own sanctions regime. While it has been very helpful, what we're seeing is patterns of shifting changes. Now it's about, incorporating and through subsidiaries, new monetary flows that are going through, a lot of sanctions that have been grandfathered. So we're actually not seeing, I think, as much power of those sanctions. This is the thing that we have to understand. Russia's tactics are always evolving and adapting. What we're fighting against 2 years ago of a sanctions pattern may have already shifted into other arenas. other areas. And that's why it is a constant moving target. It's a whack-a-mole. We have to be very forward-leaning. So even though we have a robust sanctions regime, I don't think we can think about that as being very sufficient. And then finally, there's a lot of concern about the Magnitsky Act being very, very concerning to them. And the Europeans are now increasingly adopting that legislation, which is adding additional concern. So we see some progress, but we also see some loopholes that are now being used to great effect.
Mr. Nunes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador